How do we honor those who give their lives in service to our country? We build monuments to them. Or sometimes they build monuments themselves before dying. At the start of World War II, the U.S. suffered its largest surrender ever. It was in the Philippines and gave rise to a horrific event called the Bataan Death March. At the end of the march was Camp O'Donnell, a containment facility where the defeated, starved, and disease-ridden prisoners began dying by the hundreds. John Olson was appointed record keeper for the camp. He was a recent West Point graduate. Roosevelt had spoken to his class. At O'Donnell, 1,547 Americans died and were dumped into mass graves. Olson recorded the name, hometown, and cause of death for each of them. After the war, he found himself haunted by the remembrance of those men. 2 decades later, he returned to the site of the infamous prison. Nothing remained, but in the distance, something caught his eye. He began flashing back. His last day at the camp, a guard pointing to a sack of cement and telling Olson and another officer to make a Shinto shrine for the Japanese guards who had died at the camp. But Olson and his fellow officer joked that they should instead build a cross for the Americans, even if it might cost them their lives. Olson was called away before they could start mixing the cement. Now, it was 20 years later. He was looking at the sack of cement cross, abandoned, uncared for, left behind. For the next 30 years, Olson would make saving the cross his obsession. To strangers, it was just a forgotten war relic, but to him, it was the spirit of the men themselves. He published an article about it. He begged for help in saving it from deterioration. But when he made his case to the U.S. State Department, he was rebuffed at every turn. The politics with the Philippines were too complicated. He appealed to politicians in the Philippines. He wrote letter after letter. He begged members of Congress to help. His friends worried about his obsession with the cross. He had one powerful friend, Frank Walton, the Los Angeles chief of police, who was well connected. But Frank wrote to him,
"The cross represents a poignant memento to the thousands that died at Camp O'Donnell, but I think it's fitting that it's there in that barren place. Any suggestion to move it someplace else is ridiculous."
By 1992, the cross was doomed. The U.S. was handing back to the Philippines the land it was on. Growing anti-U.S. hostility guaranteed it would be destroyed. But the director of the National Prisoner of War Museum in Andersonville, Georgia, had told Olson if he could get the cross back to the U.S., they would put it on display. So in a final effort of desperation, John Olson flew to the Philippines, recruited a group of Navy SEALs, and got the cross to a barge in Subic Bay just days before the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, which would have destroyed it. 6 months later, the cross showed up at the National Prisoner of War Museum, where today, a quarter-century later, it remains one of the largest and most popular exhibits in the museum. For Olson, the cross represented much more than a piece of cement. He had lived his entire post-war life with a feeling of having failed his men. Actually, all of the World War II prisoners of war were saddled with this feeling of failure. It's a fundamental consequence of having been a POW. But the saving of the cross provided Olson with something to take to his final rest in 2012 at age 94. A spiritual gesture for the men he felt he had let down in the nightmare known as O'Donnell.